With no further ado, I would love to bring up our keynotes today. So, Kristin Wright, who I mentioned earlier, is one of those people that I've met in my life who's like, she's a soul sister, like, just in so many ways. And she's also very down to earth, but knows so much about the work that we need to do in the state of California and nationally. She was the former director of special education at the California Department of Education, and now continues her work in a expanded way through the Sacramento County Office of Education. And we're collaborating as she has some grants from the state as well on inclusion. She'll come up first. We're going to do something a little different. So she's going to do like a TED style kind of talk and on the shorter side, right? And then Dean's going to come up and he's going to do sort of his TED style talk. And then Anna Markowitz is going to come up and moderate for the both of them. So you'll have an opportunity to ask and then engage as well with some questions and dialogue. And Dean, I had a chance to work with in LA Unified, who is just, I consider a dear friend. We both have twins and shared a lot of twin stories over the years, but also very humble, but knows so much about early education and how to, in those first years of life, how do we expand the brain? And one of my most favorite things is seeing Dean outside in the Nature Explorer classrooms with the kids as they're rolling around and having him on the floor with them. And then Anna Markowitz, who I've met more recently, but she is incredibly knowledgeable. She's one of the people like I just want to sit with and have coffee with, like, tell me more, tell me more. So we're excited to have you here today. Kristin, I'm going to have you come up, and I know you did a lot to get here today. I'm going to let you tell your story, but you don't normally have the cane, I know. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm going to stand back here just in case I need to hold on. Thank you, Allison. So, I wish it was a better story, but Mother of the Year here was taking her youngest daughter to Disneyland, and coffee on the way and that tall curb and not expecting that height, just stepped right down and tore my MCL. So, as long as I walk like a horse and just straight forward, things are good. So, but what's interesting about that, and maybe not so interesting anymore, is that we call ourselves in my family the 1% people. And if there's 1% of a chance for something to happen, it does. So we've all agreed we're not skydiving, we're not parachuting. There's things we just don't do to tempt fate. But the benefit to all of this is that working in the world of disability and disability justice, I've had a chance to just scratch the surface on experiencing things firsthand, whether it be as a parent of a daughter who's 26 years old, who has extensive support needs and has been through the public school system, or a person with two other very neurodiverse children, or a person who injured her knee and had to use a wheelchair for a week and experienced what that was like. So yesterday, when I went to the airport, I ordered my wheelchair because I didn't think I could walk all the way to the terminal. And so I was sitting downstairs at the Sacramento airport with a number of other people who were also waiting, of many different diversities. And a man came up who was blind and was also waiting for someone to help him get through everything. And we both waited, and we waited, and no one came. So together, we persevered. Him on my arm, me with my cane and my suitcases, making our way through the terminal. And I mention this because I realized how inaccessible the world was using a wheelchair for the past week. And then I realized how inaccessible the world was for a person who's blind trying to get through the Sacramento airport, especially with no assistance. And so as we got up, we made our way in the tram and around people. I only ran him into two people. And he was very generous. And we got up to the security, and the security people said, he's going to need to go in by himself. And they're standing on the other side of the security gate. And I said, well, I'm his accommodation, so I need to go with him. And they said, absolutely not. You may not go with him. They said, we'll reach our hand through. and we'll guide them through. And I said, that's not an appropriate way to work with a person who's blind. And they said, that's our rule. So he said, it's okay. I'm late for my flight. Let's just get her done. I mentioned this again because we set up these disabling conditions and then wonder why it's so hard for people. And it would have been so simple, as you know, just to have something pre-planned and in place for any kind of disability. And as I went through the security while he was waiting for me and late for his flight, I got stopped because I had my knee brace on. So then I had to spend 10 minutes being searched and prodded to make sure that I didn't have a bomb in my knee. And so, again, it reinforced how our system looks at disability and how we don't plan for things, right? And it kind of made me think again, just this morning, about school and how our disabling conditions are really what are disabling most of our students. And so the question becomes, what are we supposed to do? So I have the opportunity to work at the Sacramento County Office of Education and also the opportunity to work with the California County Superintendents. And it's nice to see Superintendent Eduardo, who is a leader in our state around justice for students with disabilities. And in that work, we're working on a number of things, but one is a grant called California Includes. And California Includes is a budget allocation to provide resources to the state around inclusion and belonging for students with disabilities. Well, that's like really super broad, right? And so for the past year, we've been working with our other inclusive practices leads in the state to figure out where are the gaps in our system? Like what are the barriers? So today I want to talk about moving from students being allowed to be somewhere to students being rightfully present. And I don't know if you all have heard about this work around rightful presence, and I'll describe it in a few minutes. But just to say that it's really about the fact that people, humans, have a right to be wherever other humans are. It doesn't seem to, we make it really complicated. And so as we were doing our research, and we did a huge survey in the state, and we surveyed people about what they thought about special education and students with disabilities and inclusion. And the number one barrier that came across was really around mindset. And we have tried to legislate everything in the world, but the one thing we cannot legislate is mindset. So what do we do with that? Well, Dean's going to talk in a few minutes about we have to start that as early as possible in preschool, because it's not just the mindset of people outside of special education or students with disabilities. It's even parents like me, who before I had a child with disabilities, I was probably one of the most ablest people that ever was. I just didn't know. And so we have a federal law, thank goodness, right? It serves as the foundation of human rights around supporting individuals with disabilities in school. It's celebrating its 50-year anniversary this year. If you think about the original act, and it hasn't been updated for a while, a good 20 years. Well, as you know, a lot has happened in 20 years. The world has changed incredibly. And so with the act, it really guarantees that students with disabilities are to be with their peers without disabilities and have the same rights. That in and of itself sets a tone that we continue to focus on, which is that we have students, special ed, and we have general ed. We have students with disabilities and students without disabilities. And to a certain extent, it's allowed us to, as a system, other students. And so these sentiments that I want to talk about today are my own. They're based on my own lived experiences. They're also based on data, okay? And so if you look at our students with disabilities in California right now, We have 850,000 students. I just pulled this off of the state board presentation, so this is the newest data that we have in the state. If you look at, and back to Jenny's comments earlier, if you look at just the sheer number of our students that have specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, autism, and other health impairment, that's a lot of students. In fact, that number could fill 15 Dodger stadiums full capacity. So if you think about just the numbers of what that represents. So this number of 850,000 is newborn through 22 years of age. In a minute, I'm going to talk about some other rates, and those are ages 3 until 22, okay? So I want to talk about some of the constraints around IDEA, and make no mistake, I highly respect this federal law. Again, this is the foundation by which parents and people with disabilities have been able to get their rights and be present. But what it also has done, and if you go back and look, all these different categories, you have to qualify under one of them, right? So by definition, we're sorting you. And when you sort people, you sometimes other them because we have these ideas and stereotypes about certain categories. And also, you'll notice in a minute when I show you some new data that when you get sorted in those categories and we have these opinions about you, you go to a separate place. And in California, the separate place you go to is 3 times disproportionately Black students. And so when we're thinking about how we're thinking about justice, what we're talking about is a resegregation of students. And that is very concerning, especially today. So one other thing that I'll point out is, and Allison talked about the local control funding formula and how our schools are funded. Our percentages of students with disabilities continues to rise. Our enrollment continues to decline. The money that we get, each school and school system gets to serve students with disabilities is based on the total enrollment of a school district. So if you can imagine, more students are being identified, needing more supports and more people to case manage them, and schools are getting less money to support them, what do you think's happening? People are perceiving students with disabilities as taking the money, right? And that's part of the problem with them even being identified in special education, is that now we've forgotten that they're general ed students, first and foremost, and now they're over here taking the money from someone else, right? So in talking to Mike Kirst recently, there's some thinking around how do we think about the formula that also includes students with disabilities instead of having a completely different funding mechanism for students with disabilities that continues this perpetuating of this idea that they're taking the money, right? So the constraints that I'm talking about today are really about that perpetuation of stereotypes. It's not really about the civil rights that are in the law itself. It's really thinking about how are we thinking about it and continue to think about these disability categories and how we're using the federal law. It was also built on the medical model. We know now that there's a social model and a justice model around disability that is what the disability community prefers. And so how do we start honoring that in the context of a system that's built on a medical model? And if it's a medical model, then we're treating the disability as opposed to treating the child. And we know from what we just learned from Jenny that the conditions for learning are more, if not, probably more important than treating a disability, which we know is a huge spectrum of needs. So, for example, autism for many years was treated by the single evidence-based practice, ABA. We're hearing now from the autism community that they may feel differently about that, right? And so how does our system continue to move forward when we're still beholden to where we're at with these very specific categories? So I want to talk briefly about least restrictive environment, and it's used often synonymously with the term inclusion. Inclusion, as you know, or probably know, has changed over the years to be a place or a school or a program. Inclusion in and of itself is a practice, and special education is really a support and service, right? So if you have an inclusion school and I don't, what kind of school do I have? And what messages is that sending, even just by you saying you have an inclusion school or an inclusion program? Because when you have a program, you have to qualify. And who qualifies for inclusion programs? Kids that don't bother other people, right? So the constraint of that provision is that the impetus is really on the student and not on the system to provide the most accessible, differentiated approach. It's really up to me as a student to try to be good and fit in and not be too much of a problem. Otherwise, I must need to go somewhere else. And our continuum of placements that we heavily rely on and hear a lot about in education is a very easy way to exclude kids. It's not working in your classroom, we need to send you to the special day class. It's not working there, we're going to send you to the county program. It's not working there, we're going to send you to the non-public school. And how weird, your behaviors keep increasing, right? We know that behaviors are communication. And for our students with the most extensive support needs, communication is one of the biggest challenges that they have. And it's one of the things we spend the least amount of time on. This is hot off the press. I just pulled this from the data from the last state board meeting, like I was talking about. So the special ed enrollment is the preschool through 22. That's the 836 students. And currently, they're spending 59% of their time, or 59% of them are spending their time in 80% or more in the general education setting. 59%. The state set targets a few years ago through the state board that by next year, 70% of students with disabilities would be spending 80% or more of their time in general education. California has only gone up at the most 1 percentage point a year for the last 15 years. So it's highly unlikely we will get from 59 to 70 by next year. So for every school and district that's an LEA, local educational agency, they will be put in a status for not meeting their statewide targets under least restrictive environment. The one thing I want to point out, and I put this notation on the bottom, African American students make up 4.9% of the total California student population. But in California, if I did the math, they make up 14% of special education identification. And if you look at separate school and setting, what do you notice? They make up the majority, many more children. They're very disproportionately represented in separate settings. This is also tracks to the prison pipeline and many things that we all know to be true, but we're not talking about. And due to a county superintendent not long ago who pushed to do some legislation to make sure that we started looking, we had the ability to go in DataQuest and look up special education enrollment by race. It's an important data point to be when we're having these conversations with districts, not just how are their students doing as a whole, but how are individual student groups doing, and where are we serving them, and how are we serving them? It was SB 692, if you haven't seen it. And what's interesting, I talked about earlier that it's hard to legislate mindset. We legislated all students are general ed students. But we know for a fact that that's already true. They earn the same money that everyone else earns in the local control funding formula at the base and for concentration, right? They also have a legal right to be rightfully present in the classroom. and that general education is and should be the first setting that's considered. That's actually federal law. So how do we actualize that? How do we make that into a reality? So rightful presence in education came from some research around sanctuary cities and around immigrants and how they were feeling about being in sanctuary cities that they came to. And this idea that if you're rightfully present somewhere, you're not a guest or visitor. You actually truly belong because you're a citizen, because you're a student in a school district, and because you have the right to be in a classroom with your peers from your neighborhood. And so this was taken by the Swift Center, who's the new federal center on serving students with more extensive needs, and adapted to students with disabilities. And this idea that really puts an exclamation mark on the federal law, which is that we all have an opportunity to be rightfully present because we are humans, because we don't have to ask permission to come to a classroom. And so this idea that if you're a teacher or a principal or an administrator, and I, as a student with a disability, have to either show that I'm good enough, show that I can behave well enough, show that I'm at grade level. These are all myths that we have bought into to make ourselves feel okay about not including students that might be more challenging to include. But that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to be rightfully present. Are you with me? Okay. So how can we move from inclusion to rightful presence? What should we do? We know that structures and systems are designed to get what they get. So if our structures and systems are designed and we allow to continue our current structures, then we're never going to get anywhere. We are never going to get beyond 60%. And if we are, students are not going to be meaningfully included. So if for a first step, what if we said every single student in a school has to be on a general ed roll? No one is a visitor in a classroom. And a teacher is a host, and everyone are guests that have a rightful presence to be there. Not a teacher that's a host and can tell you, no, you may not be here, or that you have to prove something to be here. This is public education, in fact. We need to debunk the mythology that students with disabilities need a ticket in. I know Dean's going to talk a little later about some of the great work LA Unified is doing. I visited many early education sites over the last decade that have classrooms where students earn their way up the classroom to inclusive settings. So you have a beautiful inclusive preschool that's developmentally amazing, and you have 4 other preschool classrooms of kids trying to learn how to be good or something to make their way in there. And that whole time that they're not in there, they're not getting the benefit of role modeling and their general ed peers. They're in rooms that they don't communicate, and neither do their peers. That makes no sense. That defies research. And removing that guest-host relationship like I talked about, it's that permission thing again. Let's assume everyone's coming, everybody, right? And so this came from Shelley Moore, and you've probably seen this a number of times, and I do like these visuals. But what I would argue is it's not a trajectory of where we were and where we're going. This is our system. All these things. We're doing all these things. We haven't moved to this or this. We want to. We talk about equity. We want to move to that. But really, we're still doing all those things. And we call that the continuum, and we're okay with it. I am so not okay with it. So this idea that we're teaching to diversities is amazing. And when I say diversities, I'm talking about cultural diversities. I'm talking about learning diversities, every diversity. But this idea, the next step is really to believe that everyone belongs there. It's not enough to just say we're teaching to diversities. We don't have everybody there, right? So what should we be doing? What could we do? The best practices that I've seen, and I've been able to visit a lot of schools and a lot of places in a lot of countries, is not that complicated. It's planning for diversity. It's setting up systems like should have been set up in the airport, where it doesn't require a person to navigate an inaccessible environment. The environment's already set up for any person who needs to come to it. And so that universally designed idea is not a pipe dream. And the seating is flexible and universal accommodations are available to all and normalized shouldn't be kept from students who could benefit from something. In my volunteer time, I've been attending IEPs and 504 meetings. And what I've noticed is, and heard in the last few weeks, is that some teachers are feeling burnt out by all the IEPs and 504s in their classroom. What that tells me is they're not bad teachers. What that tells me is our system has to single accommodate and adapt for half the class because what we're doing is not diverse in instruction. So at what point is the tipping point where we talk about neurodivergence, where more people are neurodivergent than what we call typical? And if we're planning for typical, we're going to miss out. And so are the kids. And they're telling us that. So in the last 504 I was in, and I'll wrap this up, the student was in middle school, and what they needed was they were getting sensory overload. They were diagnosed with ADHD. They were in hour-and-a-half blocks, and they were sitting most of the time. The student was also dyslexic, and the first 20 minutes of every class was copying off the board the questions for the day. So you can imagine every possible thing that didn't work for that student was occurring. So what was happening? The student was leaving. Well, of course they were. Wouldn't you? So the teacher said, I don't think I've ever had a student with dyslexia before. I thought, wait till the screener comes out, people. But we have to be prepared for that, right? What does happen when the screener comes out? And we hear that lots of kids have a predisposition. They're not all going to special ed. We as teachers will have to learn how to really differentiate. And so one of the agreements at the 504 was not that the student had to bring their headphones when they took a test because they needed quiet, or that they needed special permission to go outside to listen to one of the videos so that they could understand the content. The solution was that the teacher provided, and actually the parent provided, just to show them what was possible, 10 headphones in a basket that anyone could use. And the ability to use universal design to let anyone who needed context setting to watch the video, right? And so the student who was there said that they would wear the headphones if they weren't the only one. And so it's really small things like that that just don't seem that hard, that maybe feel like giving up power as a host, as a teacher sometimes. But this is a new generation of learners. So finally, if we're involving inclusion, and I say inclusion now in parentheses because I don't even like the term inclusion anymore. It's sort of lost its verve. What we're talking about is true belonging and planning for kids who have diversities. And how cool is that? And how do we gauge whether or not we've really planned for them? We look at the wheel that Eric Carter created from all his research around inclusion and belonging for students with disabilities. We make sure that we've addressed all those things for all the kids. And then we really are talking about all students. But until we switch our framing and our mindset and recognize that we're in a new dimension of learning, we're going to continue to have huge lawsuits based on a federal law that is not actually giving us everything we need. It, again, provides us the foundation of civil rights, and that is critical, but it's not enough. And so I look forward to hearing more from today, because I believe that this is exactly why we're here, and that we can all be leaders in how we are talking about students with disabilities and how we can look at our own mindsets around how we're thinking about inclusion and who belongs. And I hope you'll reach out. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, good morning, everybody. I have to share this picture with you because this is when I was a preschooler. I was 2 years old. I was much cuter as a 2-year-old than I am now, but I'm also going to share, starting in kindergarten, my first day of kindergarten went something like this. So my mom got up, took me to school. As we got to school, I went to Coliseum Street Avenue Elementary School, Coliseum Street Elementary School in LA Unified. They have this little place where your parents can drop you off and then walk you to the classroom. So on that first day of school, my mom pulled up in the car. She, unlocked the door because we didn't have electronic door locks, right? She unlocked the door, came around to the other side of the car, pushed the seat forward, opened the door, and I climbed out because I don't think we had car seats back then, as she puts it. And then walked me into the kindergarten classroom. So as she's walking me into the kindergarten classroom, she's passing kids who are stuck to their parents' leg, crying, not ready to go to school. Then there's other kids who are like laying down on the ground like a sack of rice. They don't want to go to school and they're screaming and complaining. And here I am walking right into the classroom. So she takes me into the room, she drops me off with the teacher, and she thought, wow, that was easy, right? So comes day 2. On day 2, she does the exact same thing. She pulls up in front of the school and she thought, well, that was easy. Let me just leave the car running and let me unlock the door. And as she walked around to the other side of the car, I jumped out of the back seat and I plunk locked it and plunk locked the other side of the car. So here's my mom standing with the car running, going, you better open that door. You better open that door now, right? And so I share that story because as we think about our kids, first of all, my mom would just be like dumbstruck that I'm here actually presenting to you on a topic that included the word neuroscience. She would absolutely not believe it. And so from a kid who started in school thinking about really escaping or not going to school to being somebody who's here today to present to you, that's pretty amazing. So with that said, let me just kind of start here. So within LA Unified, we have our vision and mission statement. And our vision, you can read it, but it basically says each student has the right to be treated with dignity and respect and accorded a safe, nurturing environment to meet his or her needs. All students have a right to developmentally appropriate and challenging educational program that integrates opportunities with high expectations. As a 4th-generation Japanese American, the only time I saw anything that was remotely, or when Japanese Americans were even talked about, it was because of World War II. So growing up, I had no context. Part of me was like, every time this came up in December in a history class, I thought, that's not me. I didn't bomb Pearl Harbor, and yet that vision of being treated with dignity and respect just wasn't part of my understanding as a student. And so I share that because when I started in this position and when I started teaching, it was really important for me to know my why. And so when I talk about my why and making sure that we're creating these environments that are, I'm going to say, inclusive, but also fostering dignity and respect, it's so much different than just reading it on a screen. The second reason I'm going to say my why is because as a parent with neurodiverse twins, I saw it play out in real life. You know, how they were treated at times, but I also saw how when it's done right, they're so they feel such a part of the community, right? And they have support systems. And I'm not going to read the mission, but just know that it's really important that you know your why. And so when you hear my why, and I look back at this and I say, all students have a right to a developmentally appropriate, challenging educational program, I mean all students, right? And so as you kind of, this is a whole lot of stuff. So within LA Unified, you're going to see, you'll see that we have 575,000 students, and if you throw in adult ed, it's probably closer to 650,000 students. We're 710 square miles. We have 98 different languages. But all of this said, what's critically important and why I'm here today is that we have about 31,000 kids who are preschool age students. And these preschool age students have a range. And I have to tell you that when I was a principal and I had a preschool program, if a fourth or fifth grade teacher was late or out, I could call one of the coordinators or the assistant principals and say, "Hey, could you cover that fourth or fifth grade classroom until till the teacher got here?" No problem. As soon as I said, "I need somebody to cover my preschool classroom because they're late," nobody wanted to take that classroom, because you think about it, people are scared of 24, 3 and 4 year olds. Just that thought of it was hard enough to do my 1 or 2, but to do 24 in a classroom makes it really difficult. So within our preschool programs, we're going to talk a little bit about why that's so important. And I'm going to share this as we kind of think about that path from pedagogy, and then we move to that path of reality and what's actually happening in our classrooms. I'm going to bring up 4 things. And it's really important as we look at these 4 things. What is the parent's perspective? And we'll talk about that. Why is it important to have a skilled workforce? Why is this high quality environment? And I am talking about the physical space in a room. We don't often talk about how that becomes a teacher or how that creates a sense of belonging in those. And then I'm going to talk about inclusive programming and the different programs that we're looking at. So for parents, and this is so critical that we understand that as a parent of a young child and who's first coming to a school district and they don't know anything about it, and on top of it, their child might have a special need, they're worried. They're thinking about, what does that future independence look like for my kid? One of the things that we've heard a lot, and I've heard a lot from speaking to other groups, is parents will tell you, "I have to outlive my child." And that's such a profound statement when they say, "I have to outlive my child, because if I don't outlive my child, who's going to take care of my kid?" Right? Education and learning. They're worried about what kind of education are they going to get? What's that learning going to look like for them? Social interactions and acceptance, right? What is that? What does that mean? Is my son, daughter, kid going to have friends? Are they going to get bullied? Healthcare access and quality, and depending on that child, they're worried. Do I have insurance to cover this? How am I going to make sure that all of the medical needs, everything you know, from the physical needs to the material needs, are they going to have access to that? And how am I going to pay for it? Emotional well-being, family dynamics. And within family dynamics, if there's a sibling, there's this term called parentified. a sibling of a child with special needs often becomes parentified at a very young age, right? And they didn't ask for it. And a lot of times that can turn into resentment as they get older. So, what are we doing to make sure that's addressed? Financial burdens. And then, last one, social stigma and judgment. And I'm going to share this. I have a father-in-law, and when our kids were first diagnosed, he was really adamant about, they need to be in a special day class. They need to be in they're not like the other kids. I can tell already. But his background and his culture told him that kids weren't going to be successful. And so how do we fight that? And educating him over the course of the years. And now that they're 20, he sees them very differently. But I remember those initial conversations with him. So what does the research tell us about our parents? Well, 740,000 of them nationwide have a child between ages 3 and 5 with a disability. 66% attend a part-time or a full-day inclusive environment. And I love what you shared. Our kids have a right to be there. It's not a, can I be good enough to be in this classroom? I'm a guest to your room. And a lot of times we call that mainstreaming. And that's not what we're striving for, right? And then this last statistic just blows my mind. 80 to 87% of parents who have a special needs child end up in divorce. So when you think about your role as a teacher, as an educator, a policymaker, we don't need to add any more burden to these families. We need to make sure that they feel included from the very beginning. Like, we want your kid here. This is your place. They need to be in there with us. And as we kind of build this path, and understanding parents, and we come to this next space, how are you creating an environment, right? What's that next bridge? And it's funny because, can I ask who are students in here becoming teachers? Any? Okay. Who are our professors that are in here? Okay. So as you kind of think of this, we don't often talk about parent perspectives, but I think that's important. And then we don't often talk about the high quality environment that's created, especially in early education. I love the picture that was put up earlier, and it had students in rows in 5th and 6th grade. And then by high school, it's still rows, right? If you walk into that environment, what does that tell you? Right? And I remember teaching a 6th to 8th grade intervention class. And these were kids who were 6th to 8th graders who were at least 3 grade levels behind. And so I remember coming in with my elementary kindergarten teacher mentality saying, you know what? We're going to put all these tables into groups. And when the kids came in, they were like, all right, what the heck, Mr. T? Like, this is not, we're older than this. Right? And then having them work through projects and putting things down on their table, they're like, but can I tell you, and this is how I'm going to say non-savvy I was to 6th to 8th graders. So they gave me this small class with 12 to 13 kids to start the year and do this intervention. It was a double block of English. So you're already thinking, oh my God, an hour and 40 minutes for kids who don't like to be in school already. How am I going to make this successful, right? And so I did all of these things that I brought in from elementary, from kindergarten as a kindergarten teacher, and then they started to enjoy it. What I didn't know, and this is where I'm not very good with middle school kids were starting to come in and they'd hand me a slip and say that they've been added to my class. And I take them in, Pretty soon, my class was up to 25 kids. And I'm thinking, wow, this is a lot of kids for an intervention class, right? So then the coordinator comes by, walking by, and she's like, she looks in, she looks what's happening, and she's like, man, that's a lot of kids in this room. So she leaves. She goes, how many kids do you have? And I'm like, I think there's like 25. And she's like, oh, okay. She leaves. She comes back, and she starts calling off all these names. And she's saying, all right, none of these kids belong in your class. They belong in the other room, but they want to be here, right? And it was that inclusive kind of space that made it important. Within early education, these environments have to be developmentally appropriate. They have to be able to really call out this idea of they're designed to build choice. And I like to say that choice at this age leads to student voice later on. And so these kids now have the opportunity to become independent, self-confident, make choices that are good for them. And later on, as their voice develops, they can do that same thing. And this last little part, able to speak to the needs of a young child. When they come into that room, they need to know that this place is safe. There's a place for me in this room. There's a place that has choices. There's a place that allows for collaboration, but also congregation, right? And to get together. And there's a last one is so important. Kids need to know that there's a place for them to go to when they need to be alone. It's not timeout, right? It's a chance for them to make their own choice, to be able to go to a space that's for them. So here's a few of those spaces, and what I'll share with you is if you kind of look to that upper left, you'll see an environment in our preschool programs. That's a cozy area. Kids can go there if they need a time for themselves. In the upper right, collaboration and congregation. If they want to get together with a few friends, read a book, play with some things, they have a space to do that. On the bottom left, the outside should be a place where students still have choice. It's not recess. It's not just adult supervision, right? It's a place where students can go. Do I want to go to the trikes? Do I want to build with Legos? Do I want to go to an art area? What do I want to do outside? And then finally, there's always a space for a whole group activity. But I like to say for adults, our brains can only handle what our seat can endure, right? For kids, how long is that? It's probably just a few minutes, right? So you need to be able to get them up, moving, do whole group. Maybe you do a read aloud and then they stand up and they do something and then they come back. But you need to create those spaces for our kids to be able to do that. Now, when we talk about pedagogy, you need to have a skilled workforce. You need to make investments into your teachers. You need to make investments, professors, legislators. What are those investments? If you're a teacher in here, you're becoming a teacher, you need to invest in yourself. We've done a lot of teacher professional development, coaching, and instructional support. When I started in the division 11 years ago, and I looked back at our history of investing in teacher support, because LA Unified, and I'm going to say our division gets money from the state, and we're state subsidized through them, we did more training for our fiscal managers and our office managers than we did for our teachers. So as of yesterday, or Saturday, this year alone, we've done training for over 5,000 teachers, aides, principals in just this year alone, because it's so important for us to have that. And so these important investments really I'm going to say, you cannot not have them. And then inclusive programming. We have different programs. So you'll see on the far right, we have PALS programs. This is our preschool for all learners. When I started, we had 500 plus of these programs. They are special day classes on elementary campuses with very little playground apparatus. And they're for all students. 500 of these classrooms. We now have less than 100. And we now have close to 400 preschool collaborative classrooms. And a preschool collaborative classroom is one that has, and that's that middle column, that has a gen ed teacher, an early childhood special education teacher, a gen ed aide, a special ed aide, and any other itinerant support I can put in there. But it's a full inclusion. And I like this because somebody mentioned, I think you mentioned, they're not rostered. These kids are rostered on a general education roster. When you go into these rooms, you don't know who's who, right? These kids are all out there having a good time, making their choices, and the kids don't know that. And then we have our UTK classrooms. And so there's over 100 of those, and they're specifically for 4-year-olds. All of these kids are going to go to kindergarten. And here's one of the pieces that I love to share. We had 82% of our kids who left preschool collaborative classrooms go into general education kindergarten. 68% of them went with support, but that's fine. They're fully included, and 14% exited their IEPs completely. So it can be done when you tackle it, and I'm going to say from the very beginning. Here's my information. I'm going to kind of just say, thank you for being here today, because these inclusive environments, making sure that our kids, that we understand what our parents' needs are and how we get there to bridge from pedagogy to permanent from to reality and making it a permanent solution is the way we need to go. So thank you, everybody, and I'm going to turn it over to Anna because she's going to take us to the next step. But thank you.
Kristen and Dean were so good. I feel very sad about having to follow. But mostly what I'm going to do is moderate a Q&A, but because I'm lucky enough to get the mic first, I get to ask my own questions first. I'm going to put these chairs here in case you two want to sit so folks can still see you to make it easier. Thank you. Like Jenny, I'm a developmental psychologist, and my area is on early learning, broadly speaking. And so, in getting to have this sort of setup conversation with Kristen and Dean, it was really great to start reimagining the way that UTK can do a lot for early learners. And so, the first question I wanted to ask was just how you see early education as a way of creating not just a sort of new vision, but also new practices around rightful presence in early education spaces. How can we think about UTK in particular removing that guest host dynamic? So I think, Kristen did an amazing job sort of setting a vision for us, and Dean's talking about this is what we're doing day to day. How do you see these sort of two things combining, and what can we learn from what's happening right now to keep pushing that rightful presence forward?
So what Dean is doing is revolutionary. First of all, I hope you would agree. And when something can happen at this scale in Los Angeles, the state's actual percentages move. And what I've noticed is that if people can visualize something, they can do it. So the more we have the ability to show people what this looks like and hear from teachers and administrators what this feels like, we could talk all day long, but unless we have actual demonstration spots where this happens, and what LA Unified is doing is really basically what we've been all preaching for a long time, which is backward mapping to the earliest point that people enter the system, and those classroom designs will start being what people expect as they move up the grade levels, and so I think it's like a top-down, bottom-up approach where we're doing that in preschool, and then everyone after preschool is expecting things, but we're not forgetting about the whole rest of the system that's going to need to transform. And so gratitude.
Yeah. When you talk about our kids starting at the very beginning in a regular classroom, right, in a gen ed classroom, I think that's really building from the ground up as opposed to taking mini kinder and pushing it down, because kids at that age just want to be friends, right, and they're willing to learn how to help their friend. And so as a when my kids were in a program, I was very fortunate to have teachers who created that sense of belonging for them. But it can start at the very youngest ages, and I think that's why we're pushing it.
I'm going to grab another question before I open it up. So I think something that was really striking to me during Kristen's presentation was this comment around mindsets and the importance of thinking about early educator mindsets and educator mindsets all the way through the spectrum. But I felt a sort of tension in the fact that early intervention is often seen as having this goal of reclassifying kids, getting them out of special ed. This is especially true in research, so I'll call myself out there. So I'm just wondering how you might think about mindset, and do we need to reframe the goal of inclusive early education if we have that rightful presence perspective? Do we not need to reframe that goal? How are you thinking about that sort of tension in your work as you advocate for true justice, disability justice perspective?
Want to start with that one?
Yeah. So, what's interesting is, as you're talking about this, the biggest issue that we have with these collaborative classrooms is actually amongst adults. You kind of laugh, right? It's not the kids. It's the adults who, and you talked about mindset and changing that mindset. I think that's the biggest first step, is to change the mindset of the teachers. One, you can get along, first of all, right? And in early education, we like to say, you should all be able to play in the sandbox together. But that's not always the case. And so when we talk about professional development, we did a lot of co-teaching models. So and actually we're going on probably like our sixth or seventh year of every first and third Tuesday of the month, where we bring the general education teacher and the preschool special education teacher together to co-plan and co-work with their kids, as well as give them the latest research to make them, better understanding. And so we rolled these out. When I started, there were 27 early ed collaborative classrooms, right? In our 87 centers. Now every center has a collaborative classroom. And again, we've reduced all of those special day classes to almost by 80%. So I think that mindset shift, sometimes you need to help it, right? And when people start seeing the successes and even hearing from the families how important this was for them, then they start to change their perspective too.
I would agree and add on to that, one of the conversations we've been having at the state resource level is around language and how we talk about students and children with disabilities. And our system and structures sometimes keep us separate. And so, in one hand, we're teaching inclusive practices and all kids being together, but we're still calling them SPED kiddos and special ed kids and special ed parents and special needs students. And until we start shifting how we're talking about them as professionals, parents are not going to get the signal that their students are not so different, right? And it doesn't mean not acknowledging disability or teaching disability identity or any of those things. It's really just about how we're preaching one coherent system where every student's a general ed student and then still siloing. And one of those systems that's still doing that is our teacher credentialing. And I would say that's one of the single most ways that we're perpetuating segregation and separateness of any of our policies currently in the state. And until we stop even saying the word special education teacher, because most ed specialists do not teach special education. They are experts in accessibility for children with disabilities. And so how do we move from that? How do we move into, we have teachers that everyone is a very high quality first teacher. And then we have education specialists, just like we have other specialty areas that come in for different reasons, or co-teach or whatever. So.
That's great. And it leads me into my last question. So, in your slides, Kristin, you had this line that we need to be thinking about making universal accommodations available to all and normalize. And I'm hearing that in your answer as well. And Dean, I can see that this is sort of on the ground work you're doing every day. What do you need from the folks in the room? We've talked about this multiplier effect with Jenny and Allison. We've got a lot of folks in the room. What are the changes that you want to see right now that we could be making in our practice every day to help get those mindsets on the ground and get this UDL happening?
I'll start, and as you know, I like stories, so I'm going to just start with a story. I think one of the things that as we kind of build policy and we build teacher prep programs, one, we can't forget about the parents. And including them in. The other thing is to empower our teachers, and our teachers need to be empowered and I'll share this story is when my son was in 4th grade, he had one of those really, really rough days where he, basically had a meltdown as he was standing in line for lunch, and lunch lines can be really long. So at the end of the day, the teacher, and some of the kids were freaked out, right? And they didn't know what to do. And so at the end of the day, the teacher at the end of the day said to her 4th grade students, I know Nathan had a hard day today, but is there anybody who would like to stay after school and learn a little bit more about autism? And maybe you're finding a way to we can help Nathan. 28 of the 31 students stayed after school. She had to do some research on what were things that they could do to help him, but she empowered the students in that classroom. So when the next time lunch went into and he had to stand in a lunch line, they basically had groups of students who would distract him, walk him around, save his place in line until they got to the front. And then there were another group of kids who made sure that when he got to the playground, that he was included in anything they were doing. So whether it was kickball or basketball or whatever, they always made sure to include him. So to this day, some of his best friends are those kids. And so I share that because sometimes we forget about how empowering peers can be and how an untapped resource that if the teacher's able to build that positive, encouraging environment, it's not just on the teacher to support, to support kids. It can be part of their whole classroom because they all have a right to be there along with their peers, along with their friends. And that just makes it that much better. And so I totally forgot the question, but I'm going to say I think that idea of what do you need is really just to remind, teachers that they're not alone in this, that they have other resources, that they can be empowered through the help of their kids, other faculty members, and to not reach and not to continue to learn with a growth mindset on how they can help kids feel included.
That reminds me of something that Joe Xavier, who's the director of the Department of Rehabilitation, says. He often says that the preschoolers today are the business owners of tomorrow. And they will be employing all the people with disabilities, all their friends that they knew. And so to your point, people will not be as afraid if it just becomes part of life and the human condition. But around the question, it seems like, and I know I have people a lot smarter than me here, that that if choosing to be a general ed teacher does not mean opting out of supporting students with disabilities, that mindset about and I just talked to a group of students in Sacramento, and they said, "Oh, we're studying to be general ed teachers, not special ed teachers." And I thought, "Yep, just proved my point." So it seems like in terms of our TPEs and other ways that we can have expectations that that lesson planning, and then at the administrator level, same thing when they're going around to do rounds, lesson planning has to be universally designed. Universal design is not an initiative or a program. It's just an expectation that you're planning for the diversity in your classroom, regardless of whether you have a special educator helping you or not. And so I think if we can get to that point where it just becomes like commonplace, well, of course, we support all the students in our classroom and we might need extra help with some extra specialty, but we plan so well, we barely need any help.
That's great. Questions from folks in the room?
Sure. Hi, my name is Hanata. I'm the interim principal at UCLA Lab School. We very much are on a journey of becoming a school that we consider one where everyone has a right to be there and belongs. My question is more about veteran teachers and teachers who see themselves as experts, but still are afraid and feel like they're not equipped to teach and meet the needs of the children that are in their classroom every day. How does leadership and the other coaches and directors of curriculum and instruction support them so that they feel empowered to be able to change their mindset and do the work?
Well, sometimes, and I think we all have teachers who came with the building. And I think with some of them, I like to go through this process of what I call, one, they're aware that they have children, in their rooms, and maybe they're afraid, right, of changing that. Then the desire part of it, how do you build desire for them to want to make sure that all kids are fully included? And so I think that's the first step, is one, getting them to be aware of their own fears, and then two, creating that desire. And then you need to be able to give them the ability to do it. And what I've learned is I had this fifth grade teacher who had been teaching forever, right? And he's one of those that came with the school, right? And I remember telling him one time, like, hey, you're a really good teacher, but you're not getting the results that you got because you have a different group of kids than you had before. So you're working hard, but it's like you're spinning your wheels in the mud, right? Because you haven't updated any of your teaching strategies. Let's stop wasting our energy and kind of creating some new energy. And so I think giving them, kind of that ability, let's try something small. Let's work on it from there. I think that's the first way. And then at the end of it, you have to recognize them and reward them for their efforts, And then the last thing I'll say is, if none of that works, then sometimes it goes down the other path of getting some of the wrong people off the bus and getting the right people on the bus. So, yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed over the last some years is that we have districts that are incredibly well-intentioned, and over the summer might go full inclusion. And both from a parent perspective and I think from a teacher and administrator perspective, that's really hard. You're not prepared. You don't know what that is. You're afraid. I think everyone's afraid. And with those good intentions, could be a very different framing. Instead of saying we're going full inclusion, we want to give our students the best opportunity of succeeding and learning that we can. We're looking at our data. Here's what we see. And the most successful schools that I've been to as of late are using professional learning communities that include general education and special education working very closely together across grade levels. And so trying to eliminate having special day classes with 3, 4, and 5 grade levels in one class, and then expecting as an ed specialist who actually wasn't trained typically in general education teaching to be able to give 5 grade levels worth of standards-based instruction, particularly in reading and other things with a diverse group of kids. So I think we know research, we have so much research, we know what to do. We just can kind of continue to do some of the same things over and over again. But I think we're at an important time, again, because we're seeing things like what Dean's doing and what LA is doing to be able to sort of start shifting the landscape, because I think it's parents, and I know I felt this way too, that are equally as scared as the teachers for their kids to go into general ed.
Other questions? Oh, she's coming.
I started out at a preschool at a developmental center for all early childhood education, and I had 3 to 5. We had reverse mainstreaming, and now I'm teaching middle school and high school. And the problem that I find is exactly that. The teachers are trying to teach rigor, aligned to the standards, so that the students can graduate. Now, luckily, we got the alternative diploma, but as a case manager, because I don't feel I'm an inclusion specialist, how do I support my teachers who are very, very young, who have never really had any special ed, apply those universal design for learning skills and just simply class management?
You've identified the irony of our system that education specialists can teach any content in high school where to students with the most extensive needs, while general education teachers have to have content credentials to teach students who you could say have less challenges to learning. And so to me, that doesn't make any sense. But what it does bring to mind is that if we expect every student to get access to core content, especially in high school, and that's one of the reasons that the state just passed the language around the alternative pathway to a high school diploma. So we don't even have an alternate diploma in California. We have a high school diploma for students with extensive support needs, as long as they're taking the courses that lead to graduation. And they are allowed to have alternate achievement standards to prove that they can do that. But it is a huge issue. And these are the questions we're getting is, well, if I'm teaching 4 grades in high school, we're supposed to be learning every single grade. How do we course code that? Well, what we're talking about is we're going to have our content teachers working closely with our ed specialists. And at the end of the day, a universally designed content class would be much easier to modify for a student with extensive needs than trying to do everything by yourself. Like, that makes absolutely no sense either. So we're at a precipice with what you're talking about, because I think the whole idea is to really shift that thinking, especially in high school, around if students have to have access to that core content. It's not about slapping a course code on it. It's actually giving them access to content.
I'm just going to say ditto.
Nice. I think we have time for one more question if anybody is feeling eager.
Hi, I'm Hillary Dorth. I also work at the lab school. My question is around what dean was it that really made that shift? Like, what were the biggest factors? Because it's amazing shifting from the 500 to 400, because that needs to be replicated. So, like, what would you say were the top things that contributed to that?
So I think it was a couple of things. One, let me just, unfortunately, sometimes everything is driven by data. So when we started first looking at the data, that's how we had to present it to senior leadership and to our board. Hey, this is a good thing, right? It's working for the kids. Once they understood that this is a good thing and it's working for the kids, then you can start to operationalize it. I think the other thing is, and don't get me wrong, it wasn't without its challenges, right? But I think the next thing was really doing these co-teaching models and really putting together teachers together that had the common goal of, like, this is good for our kids. And so once we hit that and it built on that idea that teachers were talking to teachers, and I love my class, I love my kids, right? Then the whole model changes.